London, 1857. The chandeliers of Pembroke House blazed with the light of 100 candles, casting a golden glow upon the cream-coloured walls of the grand ballroom. The annual winter charity ball hosted by Lady Pembroke had attracted the cream of London society. Aristocrats with ancient titles mingled with wealthy industrialists and their families, a reluctant acknowledgement of the changing times. Among them stood Valentina Montemayor, 22 years of age, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant coiffure adorned with pearl pins that complemented her emerald silk gown. She was the daughter of Edmund Montemayor, one of London's most successful merchants, whose shipping company had flourished during the expansion of British trade. Despite her family's considerable wealth, Valentina was keenly aware of the invisible barrier that separated her from the nobility who regarded the nouveaux riches with barely concealed disdain. "You appear utterly transfixed by something, my dear," observed Eleanor Bennet, Valentina's closest friend since their days at Miss Winthrop's Academy for Young Ladies. Or should I say, by someone. Valentina's gaze had indeed been drawn to a tall figure standing near the orchestra. Duke George Westmere, with his broad shoulders and commanding presence, was impossible to ignore. At 32, he possessed the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. His perfectly tailored evening attire accentuated his imposing frame, and his dark hair was impeccably styled according to current fashion. He was engaged in conversation with several gentlemen, including Lord Blackwood, whose political influence was said to reach the highest echelons of government. "I was merely observing how our esteemed Duke appears to be plotting the fate of the nation, while everyone else attempts to enjoy the evening," Valentina replied, her tone carrying a hint of criticism that made Eleanor's eyes widen. "Valentina, please moderate your remarks," Eleanor whispered urgently. "You know his reputation. They say he ruined the career of a member of Parliament with a single letter to the Times." "And that is precisely what I find so troubling," Valentina said, her voice low but intense. "The power these men wield without accountability. Did you read about the situation at the Westmere coal mines? The workers live in squalor while the Duke appears at gatherings such as this, draped in wealth extracted from their labor." Eleanor glanced nervously around them. "Your father would be mortified if he heard you speaking this way. He has worked tirelessly to secure your position in society." Valentina sighed, knowing her friend was right. Her father had indeed built their fortune through decades of shrewd business acumen, and her mother had spent years cultivating the social connections necessary for the Montemayors to be accepted in London's elite circles. Yet Valentina could not silence the voice inside her that questioned the rigid hierarchies and injustices she observed. Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Charlotte Pembroke, the daughter of their hostess. "Valentina, Eleanor, you must come quickly. Lady Hale is about to announce the beneficiaries of tonight's charity collection." The three young women made their way through the crowd to where a small platform had been erected for announcements. Lady Pembroke stood there alongside Lady Hale, the formidable widow who chaired the Ladies' Benevolent Society. Behind them stood several gentlemen, including Duke Westmere, whose presence on the platform suggested his involvement in the charitable endeavor. Lady Hale stepped forward, her voice carrying across the now hushed ballroom. "Distinguished guests, we are pleased to announce that tonight's generosity will benefit the East London Orphanage and Hospital Fund." Polite applause rippled through the assembly. "Furthermore," Lady Hale continued, "we are deeply grateful to His Grace the Duke of Westmere, who has graciously agreed to match the evening's contributions from his personal accounts." This announcement drew more enthusiastic applause, and Valentina noticed the approving nods directed toward the Duke. She observed his expression, not one of compassion or genuine concern, but the calculated smile of a man aware of the social capital his gesture would accrue. The Duke stepped forward to say a few words. "It is our duty to provide for those less fortunate, particularly the children who represent England's future. The East London Orphanage ensures these children receive proper Christian education and training for useful occupations, rather than falling into idleness and vice." Something in his tone, the condescension, the suggestion that poverty was somehow a moral failing, ignited a spark of indignation within Valentina. Before she could check herself, she found her voice rising above the murmurs of agreement. "And what of the children in your coal-mining towns, Your Grace? Do they not deserve the same concern?" A shocked silence fell over the ballroom. Eleanor clutched Valentina's arm in horror, but it was too late. The Duke's penetrating gaze had already found her in the crowd, his steel-grey eyes narrowing as he identified the source of the interruption. "I beg your pardon, miss." His voice was controlled, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "Montemayor, Valentina Montemayor." She stood her ground, ignoring the scandalized whispers erupting around her. "Reports indicate that children as young as 6 labor in your mines in Northumberland. Perhaps charity might begin within your own dominion." The Duke's jaw tightened visibly. "Miss Montemayor, I was unaware that the daughters of merchants had become authorities on estate management. Perhaps your father should devote more attention to your education in appropriate feminine accomplishments, rather than allowing you to read inflammatory pamphlets." The insult was delivered with such cutting precision that several ladies gasped. Valentina felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to wilt under his gaze. "I assure you, Your Grace, my education has been quite thorough enough to recognize hypocrisy when confronted with it." The tension in the room was palpable. Lady Pembroke stepped forward hastily, attempting to diffuse the situation. "Let us proceed to the dining room. The feast awaits our enjoyment." As the uncomfortable crowd began to disperse, the Duke descended from the platform and approached Valentina directly. The guests parted before him like the Red Sea. Eleanor had already been pulled away by her alarmed mother, leaving Valentina to face the Duke's wrath alone. He stopped before her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of sandalwood and tobacco that clung to his evening clothes. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Miss Montemayor, your behavior this evening confirms what many have long suspected about the nouveau riche. Money, it seems, cannot purchase manners or wisdom. You have the untamed tongue and impulsive nature that would bring shame upon any respectable household. You are not fit to be a wife, let alone a lady of consequence in this society." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Before she could formulate a response, he had turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing alone amidst whispers and stares. Valentina's father appeared at her side moments later, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "What has happened?" "Lady Harrington just informed me that you publicly challenged the Duke of Westmere." "Father, I merely asked a question about the conditions in his mines," Valentina said, though she knew her words had been far more pointed than a simple inquiry. Edmund Montemayor ran a hand over his face. "Valentina, do you understand what you have done? The Duke is not merely an aristocrat. He has the ear of ministers and influence in Parliament. Our shipping contracts could be affected, so we are to remain silent about injustice for the sake of business?" she asked, the hurt evident in her voice. Her father sighed deeply. "The world operates according to certain rules, my dear. I had hoped you would learn to navigate them, not challenge them so brazenly." He offered his arm. "Come, we must make our apologies to Lady Pembroke and depart before further damage is done." As they made their way toward their hostess, Valentina caught sight of the Duke once more. He was engaged in conversation with Lord Blackwood and another gentleman she recognized as Sir William Clark, a prominent banker. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and the contempt in his gaze was unmistakable. Little did she know that this confrontation would set in motion events that would irrevocably alter both their lives, binding their fates together in ways neither could possibly imagine. The consequences of Valentina's confrontation with the Duke were swift and far-reaching. Within a week, invitations that had previously flowed freely to the Montemayor household dwindled to a trickle. Doors that had once been open began to close, as rumour spread that the Duke of Westmere had been gravely offended. "I understand Lady Harrington has struck your name from the guest list for her spring garden party," said Eleanor during a quiet visit to the Montemayor home. She sat across from Valentina in the morning room, her expression sympathetic but tinged with apprehension. "Mother says it would be unwise to openly associate with you at present, though she allowed me this visit as we have been friends for so long." Valentina set down her teacup with careful precision. "Then I am to be ostracized for speaking an uncomfortable truth." Eleanor leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the fact that they were alone. "It is not merely that, Valentina. There are rumors that the Duke has made inquiries about your father's business dealings." A chill ran through Valentina. She had feared her impulsive words might have consequences for her family, but to hear it confirmed was distressing. "What sort of inquiries?" I know not the details, Eleanor replied, only that Sir William Clark was overheard mentioning a review of loans extended to shipping enterprises. Your father's name was specifically mentioned. Valentina felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had recently invested heavily in 2 new vessels, expenditures that required substantial financial backing. If that support were to be withdrawn, her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of the butler. Miss Montemayor, your father requests your presence in his study immediately. Excusing herself from Eleanor's company, Valentina made her way to her father's sanctuary, a handsomely appointed room lined with leather-bound books and maritime maps. Edmond Montemayor sat behind his mahogany desk, a letter in his hand and a grave expression on his face. "Close the door, Valentina," he said quietly. She did as instructed, then stood before him, hands clasped at her waist. "You wish to see me, father? I have received word from Barclays Bank," he began, his voice unnaturally calm. "They are calling in a portion of our loans, effective immediately. Furthermore, they have declined to finance the completion of the Aurora. The Aurora was to be the flagship of their fleet, a modern vessel designed for speed and capacity that would have secured the Montemayor Shipping Company's position for years to come. But why would they—" Valentina stopped mid-sentence, the realization dawning on her with sickening clarity. "The Duke," her father nodded slowly. "It would appear that our confrontation with His Grace has had financial repercussions. Sir William Clark sits on the bank's board of directors and is a close associate of Westmere." "Father, I'm so terribly sorry," Valentina whispered, guilt washing over her. "I never intended—" Edmund raised a hand to halt her apology. "The responsibility is not yours alone. I've perhaps been too indulgent, allowing you freedoms of expression that society does not readily permit women of your station." He sighed heavily. "However, what's done cannot be undone. We must now focus on salvaging what we can. What will you do?" "I have arranged a meeting with Mr. James Harrison of Harrison & Sons Manufacturing. They have expressed interest in a partnership that could provide the necessary capital, though the terms are not as favorable as I would wish." Valentina recognized the name. Harrison & Sons was a successful iron foundry that had expanded into various industrial ventures. Its founder, Oliver Harrison, had died the previous year, leaving the business to his son James. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she asked, eager to make amends for the damage her words had caused. Her father's expression softened slightly. "Your mother and I have discussed this at length. We believe it might be beneficial for you to spend some time away from London until this matter subsides. Your Aunt Catherine has invited you to stay with her in Bath. Exile. That was what they were proposing. A gentle banishment until her scandal was forgotten." Valentina felt a protest rising to her lips, but swallowed it. She had caused enough difficulty for her family already. "I understand," she said quietly. "When am I to leave?" "At the end of the week. The arrangements have already been made." 3 days later, as Valentina supervised the packing of her trunks, a visitor was announced. To her surprise, it was James Harrison himself who was shown into the drawing room. He was not what she had expected. Rather than the dour industrialist she had imagined, James Harrison was a man of perhaps 35 years, tall and broad-shouldered, with intelligent hazel eyes and light brown hair. His attire was fashionable, but not ostentatious, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Miss Montemayor," he said, bowing slightly. "I apologize for calling without proper introduction, but I hope to speak with you before your departure for Bath." Valentina indicated that he should take a seat. "You are acquainted with my travel plans, Mr. Harrison?" "Your father mentioned them when we discussed our business arrangements yesterday," he explained, settling into an armchair. "I must confess, your name was already familiar to me before that meeting." "Oh?" Valentina raised an eyebrow, suspecting another reference to her confrontation with the Duke. Harrison smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "Indeed. I was in attendance at Lady Pembroke's ball, though we were not formally introduced. I witnessed your exchange with the Duke of Westmere." Valentina felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "It seems I have become notorious." "I would use the word courageous, Miss Montemayor," Harrison replied, surprising her. "Few would dare question a man of Westmere's standing, particularly on a matter so close to his financial interests." She studied him carefully. "You do not share the general opinion that I was impudent and improper." On the contrary, I found your observations about the mining conditions quite astute. My own company has implemented significant improvements in our foundries after reports of similar concerns. He leaned forward slightly. Which is why I wish to speak with you directly. I don't understand. Harrison's expression grew more serious. Your father's financial predicament. It is no coincidence that it follows your confrontation with the Duke. Westmere has a reputation for eliminating perceived threats, typically through economic means. And you know this how? Because my late father found himself in a similar position 3 years ago when he opposed the Duke's attempt to monopolize railway contracts in the north. Harrison's voice carried a hint of old anger. The difference is that we were financially secure enough to weather the storm. Your father's company, with its recent expansions, is more vulnerable. Valentina felt a chill at his words. Why are you telling me this, Mr. Harrison? Because I believe in fair play, Miss Montemayor, and what the Duke is doing is anything but fair. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded newspaper. Have you seen today's edition of the Chronicle? She shook her head, accepting the paper from him. Unfolding it, she found a small article on the 3rd page. The headline read, "Questions raised about conditions in Northumberland mines." "The reporter does not mention you by name," Harrison said as she quickly scanned the article, "but he references concerns raised in London society about the treatment of workers and child labourers in mines owned by a prominent peer of the realm." Valentina looked up from the paper, her mind racing. The Duke will know the source of these concerns. Undoubtedly, Harrison agreed, and he will not be pleased. However, this presents an opportunity. An opportunity for what? For justice, Miss Montemayor. Harrison's eyes gleamed with determination. The Duke has long used his influence to silence critics and manipulate markets to his advantage, but even he must bow to public opinion if it becomes strong enough. Valentina set the newspaper aside, considering his words carefully. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Harrison? A coalition of sorts. There are others in our circle, industrialists, merchants, even some progressive members of the aristocracy, who have grown weary of Westmere's tactics. What we lack is a catalyst, a focal point for our discontent. His gaze was direct and unwavering. Your confrontation with the Duke could be that catalyst. You wish to use me as a figurehead for your opposition to the Duke? Valentina asked, uncertain whether to be flattered or offended. Harrison shook his head. Not a figurehead, Miss Montemayor, an ally. Your words at the ball demonstrated not only courage but insight. The public concerns about child labor and workers' conditions are growing. With the right approach, we could effect genuine change, and perhaps curb some of the Duke's more excessive powers in the process. The proposition was both frightening and exhilarating. Valentina had never imagined her impulsive challenge to the Duke might lead to something more substantial than social ostracism. My father's business would be protected, Harrison assured her. The partnership I've proposed includes provisions that would shield Montemayor Shipping from further financial attacks. Additionally, I have connections at Merchants Bank who would be willing to refinance your father's loans on favorable terms. Valentina rose and walked to the window, her mind working furiously. What Harrison proposed was not without risk, yet it offered a path that aligned with her principles. I am scheduled to leave for Bath the day after tomorrow, she said finally, turning back to face him. Harrison nodded. I understand the need to remove yourself from London society temporarily. However, Bath has its own social circles, including several influential families sympathetic to our cause. Your presence there could be advantageous. You suggest I continue this one campaign against the Duke from Bath? I suggest you consider all options before deciding on a course of action, Harrison replied diplomatically. Take time to reflect in Bath. I shall write to you with more specific proposals once you are settled. As he rose to depart, Valentina was struck by a sudden thought. Mr. Harrison, why would you risk the Duke's displeasure by aligning yourself with me and my family? Harrison paused, his expression somber. My father died believing that men like Westmere represented the worst aspects of our class system. Power without accountability, wealth without compassion. I share that belief. He offered a small smile. Besides, Miss Montemayor, I have always found it wise to stand on the side of those with both courage and conscience. You appear to possess an abundance of both. After Harrison's departure, Valentina sat alone in the drawing room, the newspaper still open before her. For the first time since the disastrous ball, she felt something other than regret and anxiety. Perhaps her impulsive words had not been in vain after all. Unknown to her, at that very moment across London, the Duke of Westmere was reading the same newspaper article, his face darkening with rage as he immediately connected the printed concerns to the auburn-haired woman who had dared to challenge him publicly. "Blackwood," he said to his friend who sat opposite him in the study of Westmere House, "it seems Miss Montemayor requires a more decisive response than mere social exclusion." Lord Blackwood glanced at the article. "A trifling piece buried on page 3. Hardly worth your attention, George." The Duke's fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. "Today it is page 3. Tomorrow it could be page 1. I will not have my affairs scrutinized by the daughter of a merchant, regardless of how wealthy her father may be. What do you propose?" "I believe it's time I paid a visit to my estates in Northumberland," the Duke replied, his tone deceptively casual. "The local magistrate is in need of guidance regarding the enforcement of certain laws, and perhaps while there, I shall review the operations of the mines personally." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "You intend to address the concerns raised in this article?" "I intend to ensure that no further concerns can be raised," the Duke corrected him, his steel-grey eyes cold with determination. "Miss Montemayor has presumed to interfere in matters far beyond her understanding. She will soon learn the consequences of such presumption." What neither the Duke nor Valentina could foresee was that their separate journeys, hers to Bath and his to Northumberland, would set them on a collision course that would transform them both in ways neither could imagine. Bath, May 1857. The assembly rooms of Bath glittered with candlelight, the elegant Georgian architecture providing a refined backdrop to the evening's gathering. After 2 months in the spa town, Valentina had gradually found her place within its society, thanks in large part to her Aunt Catherine's extensive connections. Catherine Sinclair, her mother's elder sister, was a widow of independent means, whose forthright manner and genuine kindness had made her a respected figure in Bath's social circles. "Remember to smile, my dear," Aunt Catherine murmured as they entered the ballroom. "You look as though you're contemplating the fall of empires, rather than attending a spring assembly." Valentina made an effort to soften her expression. "Forgive me, Aunt. My mind was elsewhere." "Dwelling on that letter from Mr. Harrison again, I presume?" Catherine's perceptive gaze missed nothing. "You've read it so many times I fear the paper will disintegrate." The letter in question had arrived a week earlier, containing news that had both disturbed and intrigued Valentina. According to Harrison's sources, the Duke of Westmere had indeed visited his Northumberland estates shortly after the newspaper article appeared. Rather than addressing the concerns about child labor, however, he had apparently dismissed several workers who were suspected of speaking to journalists, replacing the mine overseer with a man known for his harsh discipline. "His actions only confirm the truth of my accusations," Valentina had told her aunt after sharing the contents of the letter. "He seeks to silence criticism rather than remedy injustice." Catherine had listened thoughtfully before responding. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you have glimpsed only one facet of a complex situation. The Duke's responsibilities extend beyond a single mine or a handful of workers. His decisions affect thousands who depend upon his estates for their livelihood." "You defend him?" Valentina had asked, surprised. "I counsel perspective," her aunt had corrected. "I have lived long enough to know that few men are entirely villains or heroes. Even the most seemingly callous actions may stem from motives we cannot fully comprehend." These words returned to Valentina now as she surveyed the assembly room. Bath society was less rigid than London's, with a greater mix of landed gentry, professional men, and prosperous merchants. Here her family's background raised fewer eyebrows, and the scandal of her confrontation with the Duke was distant enough to be more intriguing than damning. "Miss Montemayor," a familiar voice greeted her, drawing her from her thoughts. "You appear in excellent spirits this evening." Dr. Edward Blackwell stood before her, his kind face brightened by a genuine smile. He was a physician of good reputation who had studied in Edinburgh and returned to establish a practice in his native Bath. At 40, he was unmarried, but not, as local gossip assured her, for lack of opportunities. His devotion to his patients and his progressive views on medical care had made him a frequent visitor to Catherine Sinclair's home, where Valentina had come to value his thoughtful conversation. "Dr. Blackwell," she acknowledged with a small curtsy. "I am well, thank you. And you? Not too exhausted from your rounds to enjoy the evening's entertainment?" "I find good company rejuvenating," he replied, then turned to include Catherine in his greeting. "Mrs. Sinclair, you look most elegant tonight." As they exchanged pleasantries, Valentina noticed a stir at the entrance to the ballroom. Heads turned and whispers rippled through the assembly. Following the direction of the collective gaze, she felt her heart stutter in her chest. Duke George Westmere stood in the doorway, his commanding presence causing a momentary hush before the buzz of conversation resumed at a higher pitch. He was accompanied by a striking woman whom Valentina recognized as Lady Caroline Ravenswood, a wealthy widow whose family connections were impeccable. The Duke's attendance at a Bath assembly was unexpected enough to cause a sensation. His appearance with Lady Caroline sparked immediate speculation. "Well," murmured Aunt Catherine, "this is a surprise. His Grace rarely graces Bath with his presence, particularly during the London season." Dr. Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. "I understand he owns property in the vicinity, Briarwood Abbey, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps he is conducting business in the area." Valentina remained silent, a knot forming in her stomach as she watched the Duke and his companion being greeted effusively by their hosts. She had not seen him since that fateful night at Lady Pembroke's ball, though his presence had loomed large in her thoughts and in the correspondence she maintained with James Harrison. "Valentina," her aunt said quietly, "I suggest you compose yourself. Your expression would curdle cream." Taking a deep breath, Valentina forced her features into a mask of indifference. "I am perfectly composed, Aunt Catherine." "Indeed? Then perhaps you could explain why you are gripping your fan with such force that I fear for its continued existence." Glancing down, Valentina realized she had indeed been clutching her ivory fan with white-knuckled intensity. She relaxed her grip, embarrassed by her transparent reaction. "It matters not to me who attends this assembly," she insisted, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Dr. Blackwell, observing the exchange with perceptive eyes, offered his arm. "Perhaps a turn about the room would be beneficial, Miss Montemayor. I have been eager to continue our discussion on Florence Nightingale's work in the Crimea." Grateful for the diversion, Valentina accepted his arm. As they began to circulate through the room, she was acutely aware of the Duke's presence. Like a magnetic pull she was fighting to resist. She focused intently on Dr. Blackwell's conversation, responding with animation to his observations about modern nursing practices. For nearly an hour she managed to avoid direct encounter with the Duke, though she could not help but notice his movements from the corner of her eye. He danced once with Lady Caroline, then engaged in conversation with several gentlemen near the card-room. Throughout, he gave no indication that he had observed Valentina's presence. The reprieve ended when Aunt Catherine approached with Lady Harrington, a mutual acquaintance from London who was visiting Bath for the waters. "Valentina, you remember Lady Harrington?" Catherine said, a warning in her eyes that communicated the need for polite civility despite past frictions. "Of course," Valentina replied, curtsying appropriately. "How lovely to see you again, Lady Harrington. I trust you are finding Bath restorative?" Lady Harrington's smile was thin but correct. "Indeed, Miss Montemayor, the waters are most beneficial for my constitution." "I understand you have been in Bath for some time now?" 2 months, Valentina confirmed. "My aunt has been kind enough to host me for an extended visit." "How fortunate," Lady Harrington murmured, her gaze drifting past Valentina to fix on something, or someone behind her. "Ah, Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure to encounter you in Bath." Valentina felt a chill run down her spine as she realized who had approached their circle. Steeling herself, she turned to face the Duke of Westmere. He looked much as she remembered, imposing, impeccably attired, his dark hair contrasting with the pristine white of his cravat. His steel-grey eyes betrayed no surprise at finding her in his path. "Lady Harrington," he acknowledged with a slight bow, then nodded to Catherine. "Mrs. Sinclair, I believe. We were introduced at the Countess of Mersey's reception last year." "Indeed, Your Grace," Catherine replied. "May I present my niece, Miss Valentina Montemayor?" The Duke's gaze finally settled on Valentina, his expression unreadable. "Miss Montemayor and I are already acquainted," he said, his tone neutral, "though I was unaware she had connections in Bath. My aunt has been most generous in introducing me to local society." Valentina said, amazed at the steadiness of her own voice. An awkward silence threatened to descend, but Catherine smoothly intervened. I understand you own property near Bath, Your Grace? Briarwood Abbey lies some 7 miles to the north, he confirmed. I am conducting a review of my estates in the region. Dr. Blackwell, who had remained quietly at Valentina's side, chose this moment to join the conversation. I believe Briarwood includes several tenant farms and a woolen mill, if I'm not mistaken. The Duke's gaze shifted to assess the physician. You are well informed, Doctor. Blackwell, Edward Blackwell. I have treated some of the workers from your mill over the years. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, a momentary tension quickly masked. I see. And what is your assessment of their general health, Dr. Blackwell? The question surprised Valentina. It seemed a genuine inquiry rather than a mere social nicety. Dr. Blackwell considered his response carefully. The conditions at Briarwood Mill are better than many I have observed, though there is always room for improvement. Proper ventilation remains a concern in most textile operations. The Duke nodded thoughtfully. An issue that has been brought to my attention by my steward. I intend to inspect the facilities personally tomorrow. A hands-on approach to estate management is commendable, Valentina found herself saying, unable to resist the opportunity to engage. Do you apply similar personal oversight to all your holdings, Your Grace? The challenge in her question was subtle, but unmistakable. The Duke's expression hardened almost imperceptibly before he responded. I endeavour to fulfill my responsibilities to all who depend upon my estates, Miss Montemayor, a concept that might be difficult to grasp for those whose experience extends only to drawing-room discussions of social theory. The barb was delivered with such polished civility that Lady Harrington, not catching the undercurrent, smiled approvingly. Catherine and Dr. Blackwell, however, exchanged a concerned glance. Theory and practice need not be mutually exclusive, Valentina countered. Indeed, the most effective improvements often arise when observation informs understanding and understanding guides action. For a moment, the Duke seemed taken aback by her response, not angry but perhaps reassessing. Before he could reply, however, the orchestra began the opening notes of a quadrille. I believe this is our dance, Miss Montemayor, Dr. Blackwell said quickly, offering his arm. Grateful for the escape, Valentina allowed him to lead her toward the dance floor. As they took their positions, she risked a glance back to find the Duke still watching her, an inscrutable expression on his face. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for the outing Aunt Catherine had planned to the botanical gardens. Valentina, however, found herself restless and distracted as they walked among the carefully tended beds of exotic plants. Your body may be present, my dear, but your mind is clearly elsewhere, Catherine observed after Valentina failed to respond to a question about the ornamental fountain they were passing. Would it help to speak of what troubles you? Valentina sighed, knowing her aunt deserved honesty. I cannot stop thinking about my encounter with the Duke last night. I thought as much. He certainly seemed to provoke a strong reaction in you. It is not the man himself but what he represents, Valentina insisted, though even to her own ears the protest sounded hollow. The arrogance, the unquestioned authority. And yet, Catherine interrupted gently, he mentioned a personal inspection of his mill to address the very concerns Dr. Blackwell raised. That hardly suggests a man indifferent to the welfare of those in his employ. Valentina frowned, having wrestled with the same contradiction since the previous evening. One gesture does not redeem years of negligence. Perhaps not, her aunt agreed, but it might indicate a capacity for growth and change, qualities worth acknowledging even in those we have cast as villains in our personal narratives. Before Valentina could respond, they were hailed by a familiar voice. Dr. Blackwell approached along the garden path, his expression animated. Mrs. Sinclair, Miss Montemayor, how fortuitous to encounter you here. I have just come from a most interesting morning. Do tell, Dr. Blackwell, Catherine encouraged, indicating that he should join their stroll. I received an unexpected summons at dawn, he explained. A messenger from Briarwood Abbey requesting my presence at the woolen mill on a matter of some urgency. Valentina's interest was immediately piqued. The Duke's mill? What was the emergency? Not an emergency as such, but rather a consultation. It seems His Grace was conducting his promised inspection and wished for a medical opinion on certain conditions he observed. Dr. Blackwell's tone held a note of surprise, mixed with respect. I must confess, I was skeptical of his motives initially, but the Duke appeared genuinely concerned about the dust levels in the carding room and their effect on the workers' lungs. Valentina's brow furrowed in confusion. He sought your advice on improving conditions? Indeed, and more than that, he implemented changes immediately, ordered additional windows cut into the north wall for cross-ventilation, and limited the working hours in the most affected areas. Dr. Blackwell shook his head in apparent wonder. He even instructed his steward to arrange for regular medical examinations for all mill workers at the estate's expense. That is not what I expected, Valentina admitted, struggling to reconcile this account with her perception of the Duke. Catherine gave her a knowing look. As I suggested, people are rarely as one-dimensional as we might prefer to believe. There's more, Dr. Blackwell continued. When I mentioned the cases of respiratory ailments I've treated among the mill children, he seemed genuinely disturbed. By midday he had issued orders that no child under 12 is to be employed in the dusty sections of the mill, and those between 12 and 15 are to divide their time between work and schooling. Valentina felt oddly unsettled by this information. The Duke's actions contradicted the callous aristocrat she had constructed in her mind, the man who had dismissed her as unfit to be a wife, who had allegedly punished workers in Northumberland for speaking out. Did His Grace happen to mention his recent visit to his northern mines? She asked carefully. Dr. Blackwell nodded. As a matter of fact, he did. It appears the newspaper article that caused such a stir in London prompted his journey to Northumberland. According to the Duke, he found conditions there significantly worse than reported and has implemented similar reforms, though he mentioned resistance from the local overseer, whom he subsequently replaced. Catherine raised an eyebrow at Valentina, perhaps not quite the vindictive action Mr. Harrison's letter suggested. Valentina felt her certainties beginning to crumble. I don't understand. If the Duke is indeed concerned with the welfare of his workers, why did he react with such hostility to my questions at Lady Pembroke's ball? That, said a deep voice from behind them, is a fair question, Miss Montemayor. The three turned in surprise to find Duke George Westmere himself, standing a few paces away, having apparently overheard their conversation. He wore riding clothes, his tall boots slightly dusty as if he had just dismounted. Your Grace, Catherine acknowledged with a curtsy, recovering first from the surprise. What an unexpected pleasure. The Duke bowed formally. Mrs. Sinclair, Dr. Blackwell. His gaze then settled on Valentina. Miss Montemayor, might I request a moment of your time? With your aunt's permission, of course. Catherine glanced at her niece, silently asking if she wished for this conversation. After a moment's hesitation, Valentina nodded slightly. Dr. Blackwell was just describing to me a fascinating species of orchid near the conservatory, Catherine said smoothly. Perhaps you might show it to me while my niece speaks with the Duke. Once they were alone on the garden path, an awkward silence fell. The Duke gestured toward a nearby stone bench. Shall we sit? Valentina nodded, arranging her pale blue walking dress as she took her place. The Duke remained standing for a moment, seemingly gathering his thoughts, before joining her at a proper distance. I owe you an explanation, Miss Montemayor, he began, his tone more measured than she had ever heard from him, and, I believe, an apology. The admission was so unexpected that Valentina found herself momentarily speechless. My reaction at Lady Pembroke's ball was excessive, he continued when she didn't speak. While your manner of address was perhaps unconventional, the substance of your concerns was not without merit. Then why respond with such dismissive cruelty? Valentina asked, finding her voice at last. The Duke's jaw tightened, but his response was thoughtful rather than defensive. Pride, primarily. I am unaccustomed to being challenged, particularly in public and by a... He paused, reconsidering his words. By a merchant's daughter? Valentina supplied, a hint of her old fire returning. By anyone, he corrected, but especially by someone whose critique struck closer to home than I cared to admit. He turned slightly to face her more directly. The truth, Miss Montemayor, is that I had delegated the management of my northern properties to stewards whom I trusted to maintain the standards I expect. That trust, it appears, was misplaced. So the newspaper article prompted me to investigate personally, he confirmed. What I found was troubling. Conditions had deteriorated significantly since my last inspection 3 years ago. Children as young as you described were indeed working in dangerous situations, contrary to my explicit instructions. Valentina studied his face, searching for signs of dissembling but finding none. His grey eyes held a gravity she had not noticed before, and something else. Perhaps regret. "Doctor, Blackwell mentioned changes you've implemented," she said cautiously. The Duke nodded. "The most egregious issues have been addressed immediately. Longer-term improvements will require more substantial investment, which I have already set in motion." He paused, a shadow crossing his features. "However, I must acknowledge that had you not spoken out, these conditions might have continued indefinitely." The admission clearly cost him something in pride, and Valentina found herself unexpectedly moved by his honesty. "Why tell me this, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. "You could have made these changes silently, without acknowledging my role." "Because integrity demands honesty, Miss Montemayor," he replied simply. "And because I wish to make amends for my words that night." His expression grew somber. "I said things that were unjust and unkind. You are not unfit to be a wife. On the contrary, your concern for others and your courage in expressing that concern are qualities that any man of sense would value." The apology, so unexpected and direct, left Valentina momentarily flustered. She looked down at her gloved hands, gathering her composure before responding. "I appreciate your candor, Your Grace, and I must acknowledge that my approach that evening was perhaps more confrontational than necessary. My passion for justice sometimes overshadows my discretion." A faint smile touched the Duke's lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, a quality I am beginning to understand, if not yet fully appreciate. Something shifted between them in that moment, not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of complexity on both sides that made forgiveness possible. "I understand from Mr. Harrison that my actions had consequences for your family's business," the Duke said after a pause. "Another wrong I wish to rectify." Valentina straightened, her pride reasserting itself. "We require no charity, Your Grace." "I offer none," he replied evenly. "Merely the removal of artificial obstacles I helped create. Sir William Clark has already been instructed to reassess the loans to Montemayor Shipping on their financial merits alone. I believe your father will find the terms more favorable upon his next meeting with the bank." Before Valentina could formulate a response, a commotion near the garden entrance caught their attention. A rider had arrived in some haste and was now speaking urgently to a groundskeeper while pointing in their direction. The Duke rose, instantly alert. Something is amiss. The messenger, spotting them, hurried down the path and came to an abrupt halt before the Duke, touching his cap in hasty respect. "Your Grace, urgent news from Briarwood Mill. There's been an accident, a fire in the east wing. Mr. Patterson sent me to find you immediately." The Duke's face paled. "Casualties?" "Several injured, Your Grace. The fire is contained, but the medical help is insufficient." Without hesitation, the Duke turned to Valentina. "Please convey my apologies to your aunt. I must return to the mill at once." "Wait," Valentina said, rising quickly. "Dr. Blackwell is here in the gardens. His assistance would surely be valuable." "Indeed," the Duke agreed. "If you would be so kind as to locate him while I secure transportation." "I'll do more than that," Valentina said with sudden determination. "My aunt's carriage can transport Dr. Blackwell and any medical supplies he needs, and I have some experience with nursing from my volunteer work at St. Thomas's Hospital in London." The Duke looked as if he might object, then reconsidered. "Your assistance would be most welcome, provided your aunt consents. The situation may be distressing." "I am not easily distressed when there is work to be done," Valentina assured him, already gathering her skirts to move more quickly. "I shall find Dr. Blackwell and my aunt immediately." The journey to Briarwood Mill was tense and swift. Dr. Blackwell had quickly assembled what medical supplies were available, while Aunt Catherine, after a moment's concern, had not only given her permission but insisted on accompanying them, citing her own experience managing household accidents on her late husband's estate. The scene that greeted them upon arrival was one of controlled chaos. The fire had been extinguished, but smoke still hung in the air as workers and village volunteers moved about with purpose, carrying buckets of water and tending to the injured who had been brought outside to the mill yard. Dr. Blackwell immediately took charge of the medical situation, directing the establishment of a treatment area under the shelter of a large oak tree. Valentina set to work alongside him, cleaning and bandaging burns, while Catherine organized the female mill workers to prepare bandages and boil water for sterilizing instruments. The Duke, meanwhile, moved through the scene with an authority that seemed to calm rather than intimidate. He spoke with the mill manager, the fire brigade, and the injured workers in turn, his manner direct but compassionate. As the afternoon wore on, Valentina found herself working in unexpected harmony with the Duke. When supplies ran short, he dispatched riders to fetch more from the abbey. When families arrived seeking news of their loved ones, he personally ensured they received accurate information and assistance. By evening, the immediate crisis had passed. The most severely injured had been transported to the local infirmary or to Briarwood Abbey itself, where the housekeeper had prepared rooms for their care. The remaining workers had been sent home with compensation for lost wages, and a small crew remained to secure the damaged section of the mill. Exhausted but satisfied with their efforts, Valentina stood at the edge of the mill yard, watching as the sunset cast a golden glow over the scene of the day's emergency. She had removed her outer jacket hours before, and her simple dress was smudged with soot and small bloodstains, her hair falling loose from its pins after hours of exertion. "You are remarkably capable in a crisis, Miss Montemayor." She turned to find the Duke approaching, his own appearance similarly disheveled. His cravat was long gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms darkened with soot, and a small burn mark was visible on one hand where he had helped move a fallen beam. "As are you, Your Grace," she replied honestly. "I confess I did not expect to see a Duke personally assisting injured workers. Did you imagine I would stand aside in fine clothing, issuing orders from a safe distance?" There was no anger in his question, only genuine curiosity. Valentina considered her answer carefully. Perhaps once, but no longer. He nodded, accepting her response. "People are often more than the positions they occupy, Miss Montemayor. A lesson I find myself learning with increasing frequency in your presence." The simple honesty of his statement touched her more deeply than any formal compliment might have. For the first time, she looked at him not as the Duke of Westmere, embodiment of aristocratic privilege, but as George, a man with responsibilities he took seriously and the capacity to learn and grow. "Dr. Blackwell says all the injured should recover," she said, turning back to the mill, "though some will carry scars. As will the memory of this community," the Duke replied soberly. "But we rebuild and learn from tragedy. The mill will be restored with improved safety measures." He paused, then added quietly, "I am grateful for your assistance today, Miss Montemayor. Your presence made a significant difference." "Valentina," she said impulsively, "after a day such as this, perhaps we might dispense with some formality." Surprise registered in his eyes, followed by something warmer. "Valentina, then." "And I am George, at least in private conversation." The simple exchange of names seemed to cross a boundary more significant than either could have anticipated. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the last of the activity in the mill yard wound down. "Your aunt is looking for you," George finally said, nodding toward the makeshift medical station where Catherine was speaking with Dr. Blackwell. "I've arranged for my carriage to return you all to Bath. It will be dark soon." "Of course." Valentina moved to join her aunt, then paused, turning back to him. "Will you return to London now that your inspection is complete?" "Not immediately," he replied. "There is still much to be done here, and I find myself reconsidering certain priorities." His gaze held hers for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Perhaps our paths will cross again before your return to London." "Perhaps they will," Valentina agreed, surprised by how much she hoped it might be true. As the carriage carried them back to Bath that evening, Aunt Catherine observed her niece with knowing eyes. "A most illuminating day," she remarked. "In more ways than one, I think." Valentina merely nodded, her thoughts still at Briarwood Mill, with a man who had begun to demolish every preconception she had formed about him and about her own heart. The weeks following the Briarwood Mill fire marked a period of profound transformation, not only for the mill itself, but for the lives of all those connected to it. True to his word, the Duke had immediately begun reconstruction with enhanced safety features, establishing a fund to support the injured workers and their families during their recovery. Word of these actions spread quickly through Bath society, altering perceptions of a man previously known primarily for his wealth and influence rather than his character. Even more remarkable to local observers was the Duke's continued presence in the area, as he took personal interest in the restoration efforts, instead of delegating to subordinates as might have been expected. For Valentina, this time brought a different kind of transformation, an internal reconciliation of the man she had first encountered in London with the one she was coming to know in Bath. Their paths crossed with increasing frequency, at the assembly rooms, where he now acknowledged her with genuine warmth, at Dr. Blackwell's small hospital, where they both visited recovering mill workers, and occasionally in the pump room where morning gatherings allowed for conversation that gradually evolved from cautious civility to something approaching friendship. "You seem remarkably content for someone who was effectively exiled to Bath as punishment," observed Eleanor Bennet, who had arrived for a visit 3 weeks after the mill fire. They were taking tea in Aunt Catherine's drawing room, the windows open to admit the gentle summer breeze. "Exile has proven more educational than punitive," Valentina replied with a small smile. "Bath society is less rigid than London's, allowing for discussions beyond the usual topics of fashion and marriage prospects." Eleanor studied her friend carefully. "And does the Duke of Westmere's continued presence in Bath contribute to this educational experience?" Valentina felt a warmth rise to her cheeks. "His Grace has shown himself to be more complex than I initially judged." "So I've gathered from your letters," Eleanor said, setting down her teacup, "though I must confess I find it difficult to reconcile the man who publicly humiliated you in London with this paragon of reform and compassion you now describe." "Not a paragon," Valentina corrected. "A man capable of growth and change and willing to acknowledge error, which is rarer still among those of his station. And handsome besides," Eleanor added with a mischievous glint in her eye, "a quality you've neglected to mention in your correspondence." Valentina busied herself with rearranging the tea things. "His appearance is immaterial to his character." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, clearly unconvinced. "Just as his title and fortune are entirely irrelevant to the transformation in your opinion of him." "You are impossible," Valentina sighed, though without rancor. "If you must know, we have established a cordial understanding based on shared concerns for the welfare of those dependent on his estates. Nothing more." Eleanor might have pressed further, but they were interrupted by the arrival of Aunt Catherine, who entered the drawing room with a letter in hand and an expression of mixed concern and excitement. "This just arrived from your father," she announced, handing the letter to Valentina. "It appears the situation in London has taken an unexpected turn." Valentina quickly broke the seal and scanned the contents, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she read. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward with concern. "My father writes that Lord Blackwood has been making inquiries about our family, our history, connections, even my mother's lineage," Valentina explained, looking up from the letter. "And he has heard rumors that similar investigations are being conducted regarding Mr. Harrison's business affairs." "Lord Blackwood?" Catherine frowned. "The Duke's close associate?" Valentina nodded, her mind racing. "Father believes these inquiries may be preliminary to some form of legal or financial action against both our family and the Harrisons." "But why?" Eleanor asked. "I thought you said relations with the Duke had improved." "They have, at least between His Grace and myself," Valentina replied, rereading a particular passage in the letter. "But my father also mentions that there are whispers of a possible merger between Harrison's manufacturing interests and Montemayor Shipping, which would create a formidable commercial entity." Catherine's expression cleared slightly. "Ah, and such a merger might be perceived as a challenge to certain aristocratic business interests, including, perhaps, the Duke's." "Precisely," Valentina confirmed, a knot forming in her stomach. Had she misjudged George after all? Was his apparent transformation merely a calculated strategy to gain her confidence while he worked against her family's interests through his friend Lord Blackwood? "What will you do?" Eleanor asked quietly. Valentina folded the letter carefully, her decision already forming. "I believe it is time I spoke directly with the Duke. If he is involved in these investigations, I want to understand his motives. And if he is not..." She left the alternative unspoken, Unwilling to acknowledge how much she hoped for the latter, an opportunity to seek clarification presented itself the following afternoon at Lady Wesley's garden party. The event, held in the expansive grounds of Wesley Manor, just outside Bath, had drawn most of the local society and several visitors from London, including Lord Blackwood himself, a coincidence that heightened Valentina's determination to discover the truth. She spotted the Duke almost immediately upon arrival, engaged in conversation with their hostess near a magnificent fountain that formed the centerpiece of the formal gardens. He was impeccably dressed as always, his tall figure distinguished even among the fashionable crowd. When his gaze met hers across the lawn, she thought she detected a warmth that made her momentary suspicions seem foolish. Yet her father's letter demanded investigation. It was nearly an hour before she managed to speak with him privately, finding him alone near a secluded section of the garden where Lady Wesley's renowned rose collection was displayed to particular advantage. "Your Grace," she greeted him formally, conscious of distant observers. "Miss Montemayor," he returned with a slight bow. "I had begun to think you were avoiding my company today." "Not avoiding," she corrected, "merely waiting for an appropriate moment to discuss a matter of some delicacy." His expression grew more serious. "I am at your disposal. Perhaps we might walk among the roses. They provide a pleasant backdrop for even difficult conversations." As they strolled side by side, maintaining a proper distance though closer than strict propriety might dictate, Valentina considered how to broach the subject tactfully. "I received a letter from my father yesterday," she began finally. "I trust Mr. Montemayor is well?" the Duke inquired. "He is in good health, yes. However, he writes with concerns that involve you or at least your close associates." She glanced at him, gauging his reaction. "Specifically, Lord Blackwood has been making inquiries into our family history and connections." The Duke's step faltered slightly, surprise evident in his features. "Blackwood? You're certain?" "My father's information comes from reliable sources," Valentina confirmed. "Similar investigations are apparently being conducted regarding the Harrison family and their business affairs." They had stopped walking now, standing amidst blooming roses, whose sweet fragrance seemed at odds with the tension of their conversation. "I know nothing of these inquiries," the Duke said after a moment, his tone grave, "and I certainly did not authorize them." Valentina studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but finding only what appeared to be genuine concern, and perhaps a hint of anger. "Then why would Lord Blackwood take such actions?" she pressed. "He is known to be your closest friend and adviser." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Blackwood acts in what he perceives to be my interests, sometimes without consultation. But in this matter, he operates entirely without my knowledge or approval." He turned to face her more directly. "Miss Montemayor Valentina, you must believe that whatever understanding we have reached these past weeks has been genuine on my part. I would not engage in such duplicity." The earnestness in his voice and the use of her given name in such a public setting, however discreet, convinced her of his sincerity more than any formal protestation might have. "I believe you," she said quietly. "But that leaves the question of Lord Blackwood's motives and what he intends to do with the information he gathers." The Duke's expression darkened. "A question I intend to resolve immediately." He glanced across the garden to where Lord Blackwood stood in conversation with Sir William Clarke. "Blackwood is here today. With your permission, I will confront him directly and put an end to these investigations." "Would it not be more prudent to observe his actions first?" Valentina suggested. "A confrontation might alert him to our awareness without revealing his true purpose." The Duke considered her words, visibly tempering his initial impulse. "A reasonable approach," he conceded, "though patience has never been my particular virtue." "So I have observed," Valentina replied with the hint of a smile. His answering smile transformed his features, softening the aristocratic reserve that had once seemed so forbidding to her. "You have observed much about me, it seems." "As you have about me," she countered gently. A moment of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of how far they had travelled from their hostile first encounter. "We should rejoin the gathering," the Duke said finally, offering his arm in a gesture that would be noted by any observant members of the party. "But this evening, I will make inquiries of my own regarding Blackwood's activities. You have my word that I will discover his intentions and ensure no harm comes to your family's interests." Valentina hesitated only briefly before placing her hand lightly on his arm. "Thank you, Your Grace." "George," he reminded her quietly, "at least between us." "George," she amended, the name feeling both foreign and strangely natural on her lips. As they emerged from the rose garden together, Valentina was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. Among the most intent observers was Lord Blackwood himself, whose expression registered first surprise, then calculation as he watched their approach. "Westmere," he greeted the Duke with practiced cordiality before turning to Valentina. "Miss Montemayor, what an unexpected pleasure to see you in Bath." "Lord Blackwood," Valentina acknowledged with a proper curtsy, betraying nothing of her suspicions. "I have been enjoying an extended stay with my aunt, Mrs. Sinclair." "Indeed?" Blackwood's smile did not reach his eyes. "And how does your father fare? I understand Montemayor Shipping has been navigating some challenging financial waters of late." The deliberate reference to her family's business difficulties confirmed Valentina's concerns about Blackwood's involvement. Before she could formulate a suitably non-committal response, the Duke intervened. "Montemayor Shipping's prospects have improved considerably," he stated with a pointed look at his friend. "In fact, I recently suggested to Sir William that the bank reconsider certain loan terms that seemed unnecessarily restrictive." Blackwood's surprise was evident, though quickly masked. "How magnanimous of you, considering past differences." "I have found that first impressions are not always reliable," the Duke replied smoothly, his hand moving to cover Valentina's where it rested on his arm, a gesture whose significance would be lost on no one present. "Miss Montemayor has helped me recognize the value of reconsidering fixed opinions." The implication hung in the air between them, causing a ripple of whispers among nearby guests. Lord Blackwood's expression hardened momentarily before he recovered his social mask. "How commendable," he murmured. "If you'll excuse me, I believe Lady Wesley requires my attention." As Blackwood withdrew, Valentina turned to the Duke with wide eyes. "That was rather public," she said quietly. "Deliberately so," he confirmed. "Blackwood understands displays of alliance. By publicly associating myself with your family's interests, I have sent a clear message that any action against Montemayor Shipping would be interpreted as an action against me personally." "A strategic gesture, then," Valentina said, trying to ignore the irrational disappointment that his actions might have been merely tactical. The Duke's grey eyes held hers with unexpected intensity. "Strategic, yes, but not merely so." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Nothing in my conduct toward you these past weeks has been mere strategy, Valentina." The sincerity in his tone sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer afternoon. Before she could respond, however, they were joined by Aunt Catherine and Dr. Blackwell, effectively ending the private moment. As the garden party continued, Valentina found herself watching the subtle currents of power and influence flowing through the gathering. Lord Blackwood moved from group to group, his manner affable, but his eyes calculating. Several times she caught him observing her interactions with the Duke, his expression increasingly troubled. By the time the event concluded in early evening, Valentina had formed a clearer understanding of the situation. Whatever Lord Blackwood's investigations had been intended to accomplish, the Duke's public display of favour toward her had disrupted those plans. Yet she sensed this was merely a temporary setback rather than a complete resolution. Her suspicions were confirmed the following morning when a letter arrived from James Harrison, delivered by private courier rather than the regular post. The contents were alarming enough that Valentina immediately sought her aunt's counsel. "Mr. Harrison writes that Lord Blackwood has approached several of his key investors, suggesting that an alliance with Montemayor Shipping would be viewed unfavourably by certain influential circles," she explained, pacing the morning room in agitation. "Two have already withdrawn their support for the partnership." Catherine frowned, considering the implications. "Despite the Duke's apparent intervention yesterday, it seems Lord Blackwood is proceeding with his campaign against your family's interests." "But why?" Valentina demanded, frustration evident in her voice. "If the Duke truly opposes these actions, why would his closest friend persist in them?" "Perhaps," Catherine suggested carefully, "because Lord Blackwood believes he is protecting the Duke from a more personal threat than mere business competition." Valentina stilled her pacing. "What do you mean?" My dear, you cannot be unaware of how your interactions with the Duke have been interpreted by society, her aunt said gently. The attention he has shown you, particularly yesterday at Lady Wesley's, it has sparked considerable speculation. Speculation that I might have designs on his title and fortune, Valentina concluded, a bitter edge to her voice. Precisely the narrative Lord Blackwood would be motivated to prevent, Catherine confirmed. Particularly if he believes the Duke's judgment has been compromised by personal sentiment. The implication was clear, though Valentina scarcely dared acknowledge it even to herself. Could George's feelings toward her have evolved so dramatically? And if so, was Lord Blackwood's interference motivated by a desire to protect his friend from what he perceived as an unsuitable attachment? I must speak with the Duke, she decided, moving toward the writing desk. A note requesting an urgent meeting. She was interrupted by the arrival of the butler, who announced with some surprise, His Grace, the Duke of Westmere, is requesting an immediate audience, madam. Catherine raised an eyebrow at this breach of morning calling etiquette. Show him into the drawing-room, Phillips. We shall join him directly. The Duke was standing by the window when they entered, his posture tense and his expression grave. He bowed formally to Catherine before addressing Valentina. Forgive the impropriety of this early call, he said without preamble, but matters have developed that require immediate discussion. We have just received concerning news ourselves, Valentina replied, gesturing to Harrison's letter which she still held. It seems Lord Blackwood has moved against Mr. Harrison's investors, despite your intervention yesterday. I am aware, the Duke confirmed grimly. I confronted Blackwood late last night and discovered the extent of his activities. What you may not know is that he has also been circulating certain insinuations about your family's background, specifically questioning your mother's lineage and suggesting that your father's wealth derives from questionable sources. Valentina felt as though she had been struck. That is outrageous. My mother comes from a respectable family of minor gentry in Hampshire, and my father's business has been conducted with absolute integrity for 30 years. I know, the Duke said, his voice softening, which is why I have severed my association with Blackwood, effective immediately. The declaration hung in the air, its significance unmistakable. Lord Blackwood had been the Duke's closest confidant and ally for over a decade. To break with him represented a seismic shift in his allegiances. Your Grace, Catherine said carefully, while we appreciate your support, such a drastic step could have significant consequences for your own position in society. I am well aware of the implications, Mrs. Sinclair, he replied with quiet determination. But I cannot maintain an alliance with a man who would employ such tactics, particularly when directed against— He hesitated, his gaze moving to Valentina. Against those for whom I have developed the highest regard. The restraint in his words only emphasized the depth of feeling behind them. Valentina felt her heart quicken, but practical concerns demanded immediate attention. What of Mr. Harrison's investors? She asked. And the rumors about my family? The damage may already be done. I've taken steps to address both issues, the Duke assured her. Letters have been dispatched to each of Harrison's investors, expressing my personal confidence in the proposed partnership and offering my own financial participation if required. As for the rumors, his expression hardened momentarily. I have made it known in the clearest possible terms that any circulation of such falsehoods will be regarded as a direct insult to me, requiring satisfaction. The implicit threat of a duel, though such affairs were now rare in English society, demonstrated the seriousness with which he viewed the situation. That is most generous, Valentina said, struggling to process the implications of his actions. But I cannot help wondering why you would place yourself in opposition to your oldest friend and ally on behalf of a family you barely know. George looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken but powerful in his gaze. I believe Mrs. Sinclair might permit us a few moments of private conversation, he said finally. Catherine glanced between them, then nodded. I shall be in the morning room should you require anything, she said tactfully, withdrawing and closing the door behind her. Once they were alone, the Duke moved closer to Valentina, close enough that she could detect the now familiar scent of sandalwood and observe the tension in his features. You ask why I would oppose Blackwood on behalf of your family, he began, his voice lower and more intimate than she had ever heard it. The answer is both simple and complex. Simple, because my actions are motivated by feelings I can no longer deny or disguise. Complex because those feelings represent a transformation I could never have anticipated when we first met. Valentina felt her breath catch. Your Grace, George, I'm not certain I understand. Then let me speak plainly, he said, taking her hand in a gesture that crossed the boundaries of propriety. When you challenged me at Lady Pembroke's ball, I responded with arrogance and cruelty, declaring you unfit to be a wife. It was the most profound misjudgment of my life. His thumb traced a gentle pattern on her palm, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. In these weeks in Bath, I have discovered a woman of remarkable intelligence, courage, and compassion, he continued. A woman who has challenged me to examine my responsibilities and privileges in ways no one else has dared. A woman who has, quite simply, transformed my understanding of what matters most in this life. Valentina stood perfectly still, scarcely breathing as the meaning of his words became clear. What I am trying to say, with perhaps less eloquence than you deserve, is that I have fallen deeply in love with you, Valentina Montemayor. Against every expectation, against the advice of my oldest friend, against the conventions of society. I love you and wish to make you my wife if you could possibly consider accepting a man who once treated you so abominably. The declaration, so heartfelt and direct, left her momentarily speechless. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. The improbability of their journey from enemies to lovers, the social obstacles that still stood between them, the transformative power of their connection. You once said I was not fit to be a wife, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Words I would give anything to unsay, he replied with genuine remorse. You would bring honor to any title, including Duchess. The question is whether you could love a man who was too blinded by pride to recognize your worth from the beginning. Valentina looked into his eyes and saw vulnerability beneath the aristocratic composure, a fear of rejection that humanized him completely. I believe, she said carefully, that we have both undergone transformations these past months. When we first met, I saw only the Duke, a symbol of privilege and power disconnected from the lives of ordinary people. Now I see George, a man capable of growth, compassion, and extraordinary courage in challenging his own assumptions. Hope flickered in his eyes. And is George someone you could come to care for? Valentina felt a smile bloom across her face as she admitted the truth she had been reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. I already care for him, far more than prudence would advise. Her voice softened. In truth, I believe I have fallen in love with him, though I scarcely dared admit it until this moment. The transformation in his expression was remarkable, the careful reserve giving way to unguarded joy. He raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that, while technically proper, carried an intimacy that made her pulse quicken. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible, he said, his voice husky with emotion. But I must be honest about the challenges we would face. Society will not easily accept our union, regardless of my title or fortune. There will be those who question your motives and others who consider you unsuitable despite all evidence to the contrary. Like Lord Blackwood, she acknowledged. Blackwood is merely the most vocal opponent, George confirmed. There will be others, including members of my own extended family, who place excessive value on ancient bloodlines and inherited status. Valentina considered this soberly. And does their opinion matter to you? Far less than it once did, he admitted. Your influence has helped me recognize that character and actions define worth more truly than birth or title. But I would not have you enter into marriage with me unaware of the difficulties you might face as Duchess. The title sounded strange in relation to herself. Duchess of Westmere, a position of significant social and political influence. Yet it was not the title that drew her to him, but the man he had revealed himself to be. I have never shied away from challenges, she reminded him with quiet confidence, and I believe we would face them more effectively together than apart. His expression softened with admiration. I have no doubt of that. Your courage continues to humble me. A knock at the door interrupted them, and they stepped apart as Aunt Catherine entered, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes sparkled with barely suppressed curiosity. Forgive the interruption, she said, but Dr. Blackwell has arrived with news he believes requires immediate attention. The doctor was shown in, his usually calm demeanor visibly disturbed. Your Grace? Miss Montemayor, I've just come from Briarwood Mill. It appears the fire 3 weeks ago may not have been an accident. What? George's posture immediately tensed. Explain. During the reconstruction, workers discovered evidence suggesting the fire was deliberately set, Dr. Blackwell elaborated. A container of lamp oil was found hidden in a wall cavity near where the fire originated, and one of the workers has reported seeing a stranger in that section of the mill shortly before the blaze began. Valentina exchanged a troubled glance with George. Who would want to sabotage the mill? She asked. The Duke's expression darkened. Someone who wished to undermine my position, or perhaps to distract me from other matters. His gaze met Valentina's, unspoken understanding passing between them. When exactly did this evidence come to light, Dr. Blackwell? This morning. The foreman sent word to the Abbey immediately, but you had already departed for Bath. And who knew of my intended visit to the Sinclair residence this morning? George asked, his tone deceptively casual. Dr. Blackwell frowned in thought. I cannot say with certainty, but I did encounter Lord Blackwood as I was leaving the Abbey. He inquired about your whereabouts, and I mentioned you had ordered your carriage prepared for a journey into Bath. The pieces fell into place with disturbing clarity. Blackwood, aware of George's growing feelings for Valentina and determined to prevent their union, had been systematically working to undermine both her family and the Duke's business interests. The timing of this new revelation about the mill fire could hardly be coincidental. I believe we must consider the possibility that Lord Blackwood's opposition extends beyond mere social disapproval, George said grimly. If he is indeed connected to the mill fire, he has crossed into far more dangerous territory. But what proof do we have? Catherine asked practically. Suspicion is not evidence, and Lord Blackwood's position in society makes him a formidable opponent. The truth often leaves traces for those who know where to look, George replied, his mind clearly working through the problem. Dr. Blackwell, I would ask you to return to the mill and ensure all physical evidence is preserved. Mrs. Sinclair, might I impose upon your hospitality for a while longer? I believe Miss Montemayor and I have important matters to discuss regarding both our personal future and this troubling development. Of course, Catherine agreed. I shall arrange for refreshments in the library where you might speak more privately. Once they were settled in the book-lined sanctuary of Catherine's library, George outlined his concerns more fully. I have known Blackwood for 15 years, he began, and while I have always recognized his ambition and occasional ruthlessness in political matters, I never imagined he would resort to such methods. Yet the evidence increasingly suggests his involvement in a coordinated campaign against your family, and more recently, against my own interests. But why would he risk so much? Valentina asked, troubled by the implications. Surely he must realize that such actions, if discovered, would destroy his own position. George considered the question carefully. I believe his motives are complex. There is, of course, his genuine conviction that an alliance between us would undermine my social and political standing, but there may be more practical concerns as well. He paused, frowning. Shortly before we encountered each other in Bath, I had begun discussing with Blackwood the possibility of investing significant capital in railway development in the north, projects that would compete directly with some of his own financial interests. And my father's partnership with Harrison would potentially strengthen those competing interests, Valentina realized, especially if you were to add your support as you mentioned yesterday. Precisely, George confirmed. What began as social disapproval may have evolved into a calculated effort to protect his financial position by driving a wedge between us and undermining both your family's business and my own industrial ventures. The scope of Blackwood's possible betrayal was staggering. If he had indeed orchestrated the mill fire, he had risked the lives of dozens of workers to advance his agenda. What do you intend to do? Valentina asked quietly. George's expression was resolute. First, secure irrefutable evidence of his involvement. If Blackwood is responsible for the fire, there will be connections that can be traced, payments to whoever set the blaze, witnesses who can place his agents at the scene. And once you have such evidence, justice must be served regardless of his social position, George stated firmly. But there is another matter of equal importance to me. He reached across the table to take her hand. I meant what I said earlier, Valentina. I wish to make you my wife, to build a life and a future together. Before this matter with Blackwood fully erupts into the public sphere, I would like to announce our engagement, with your father's blessing, of course." The proposal, though expected after their earlier conversation, still took her breath away with its directness. "You wish to announce it now, before these issues with Lord Blackwood are resolved?" "Especially now," he insisted. "A public declaration of our intentions would make clear to all that any attack on your family is an attack on me as well. It would offer protection through association with my title, while demonstrating my complete confidence in your family's integrity." Valentina considered his words, touched by both the practical protection he offered and the genuine emotion behind it. "My father would need to be consulted," she said finally, "and I would wish to speak with him in person before making such a significant commitment." "Of course," George agreed immediately. "In fact, I believe current circumstances warrant your return to London sooner rather than later. With your aunt's permission, I would escort you myself. We could depart tomorrow." The swiftness of events was dizzying, yet Valentina felt a surprising clarity amidst the tumult. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them alongside a man who had proven his capacity for growth, compassion, and unwavering loyalty. "I accept your escort," she said with a small smile, "and I will give your proposal the most serious consideration it deserves." His answering smile transformed his features, softening the aristocratic reserve into something more approachable and warm. "I can ask for nothing more fair." As predicted, Aunt Catherine readily agreed to their plan to return to London, recognizing both the practical necessity and the emotional significance of the journey. Letters were dispatched immediately to inform Edmund Montemayor of their impending arrival and to request accommodations at Westmere House be prepared for the Duke's return. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for travel. As Valentina's trunks were being loaded onto the Duke's elegant travelling carriage, Dr. Blackwell arrived with further information from the mill. "We have identified the worker who spotted the stranger before the fire," he reported in the privacy of Catherine's study. "A young man named Thomas Jennings. He claims the individual he saw was well-dressed, not someone who belonged in the mill environment, and appeared to be inspecting the east wing, where the fire later broke out." "Could he identify this person if seen again?" George asked intently. "He believes so," Dr. Blackwell confirmed. "I've arranged for him to travel to London tomorrow in the company of the mill foreman. They will await your instructions at the Westmere townhouse." "Excellent," George nodded approvingly. "This may prove crucial in establishing Blackwood's involvement, if indeed he is connected to the fire." With these arrangements in place, the farewells were brief but emotional. Aunt Catherine embraced Valentina warmly, whispering, "Follow your heart, my dear. It has proven a wiser guide than convention." The journey to London, though long, passed more quickly than Valentina might have expected. The Duke's carriage was luxuriously appointed, and his conversation made the hours fly by as they discussed everything from literature to social reform to their hopes for the future. By unspoken agreement, they avoided dwelling on the challenges that awaited them in London, choosing instead to strengthen the bond between them through shared ideas and growing understanding. They arrived in London in early evening, the city's familiar bustle both welcoming and slightly overwhelming after the relative tranquility of Bath. The Duke insisted on escorting Valentina directly to her family home before continuing to Westmere House. The Montemayor residence in Belgrave Square, while not as grand as the aristocratic mansions nearby, was an elegant testament to Edmund Montemayor's success. As the carriage drew up to the entrance, the front door opened to reveal Valentina's father waiting anxiously on the threshold. Edmund Montemayor was a tall man, with silver-streaked dark hair and the same expressive eyes as his daughter. His face registered first relief at seeing Valentina, then poorly concealed shock at the identity of her escort. "Father," Valentina said warmly as she embraced him, "may I present His Grace, the Duke of Westmere, who has kindly escorted me from Bath." Edmund bowed formally, his expression guarded. "Your Grace, this is unexpected." "Mr. Montemayor," George acknowledged with a respectful inclination of his head. "I realize my presence may come as a surprise, but I assure you my intentions are honorable and my purpose urgent." Something in his tone caused Edmund to reassess the situation. After a moment's hesitation, he gestured toward the door. "Please come in. My wife will want to greet our daughter, and then perhaps we might speak privately." The reunion with her mother was emotional but brief. Sophia Montemayor, a gentlewoman whose refined manners reflected her genteel upbringing, embraced her daughter tearfully before withdrawing to allow the men their discussion. Valentina, understanding the delicacy of the situation, accompanied her mother to the drawing room while her father led the Duke to his study. "Your father has been beside himself with worry since receiving reports of Lord Blackwood's investigations," Sophia confided, once they were alone. "And now you arrive in the company of the Duke of Westmere. You must tell me everything, Valentina." "It's a rather long story, Mother," Valentina replied with a small smile. "But in essence, the Duke and I have discovered we share more common ground than either of us initially supposed." Sophia studied her daughter's face intently. "There is more than common ground reflected in your expression, my dear." "I recognize that look. It is the same one I wore when your father first courted me, against the wishes of my family who thought a merchant beneath our station." Valentina felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "The circumstances are somewhat reversed in this case. But the heart remains the same," her mother observed wisely. "Society may erect barriers between people, but true affection has a way of finding paths around them." She squeezed Valentina's hand encouragingly. "Your father will listen with an open mind. He may have harbored resentment toward the Duke after your confrontation, but he is, above all, a practical man who values character over past grievances." Meanwhile, in the study, George was outlining the situation to Edmund Montemayor with characteristic directness. "I believe Lord Blackwood's investigations into your family are part of a calculated effort to prevent an alliance between myself and your daughter," he explained, declining the offered brandy. "What began as social disapproval has escalated to potentially criminal actions, including possible responsibility for a fire at my woolen mill that endangered many lives." Edmund listened intently, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to concern. "These are serious allegations against a prominent peer, Your Grace." "Indeed, which is why I am gathering evidence before taking formal action," George confirmed. "But there is another matter of equal importance I wish to discuss with you." He straightened, meeting Edmund's gaze directly. "Mr. Montemayor, I have developed the deepest admiration and affection for your daughter during her stay in Bath. With your permission, I wish to ask for her hand in marriage." The request, delivered with such forthright simplicity, momentarily left Edmund speechless. When he recovered, his response was equally direct. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but the last time my daughter encountered you in society, you publicly humiliated her and declared her unfit to be a wife. You then used your influence to create financial difficulties for my business. You will understand if I require some explanation of this transformation in your regard." George accepted the challenge without offense. "You are entirely justified in your concerns, Mr. Montemayor. My behavior at Lady Pembroke's ball was inexcusable, arrogant, cruel, and entirely misjudged. As for the financial pressure that followed, I must take responsibility for setting those events in motion, though the extent of the repercussions exceeded my intentions." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What I cannot adequately explain in words is the profound effect your daughter has had on my understanding of privilege, responsibility, and human worth. She challenged me to examine my assumptions and actions in ways no one ever has before. In doing so, she revealed qualities of character I have come to value above all others: intelligence, courage, compassion, and unwavering integrity." Edmund studied the Duke's face, searching for signs of insincerity, but finding none. "And the social disparity between your positions? Society will not readily accept such a match." "Society will adapt," George replied with quiet confidence. "As I have, the notion that birth determines worth has lost its hold on me, thanks largely to Valentina's influence. I would rather face social disapproval with her at my side than enjoy universal acceptance without her." The simple honesty of this declaration clearly affected Edmund. After a long moment, he asked, "Does my daughter return your feelings?" "She has indicated that she does, though she wished to speak with you before giving her final answer," George said. "I would not press her for a commitment without your blessing." Edmund nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Valentina has always possessed uncommonly good judgment, despite her occasional impulsiveness. If she has come to care for you as you claim to care for her, I would be a poor father indeed to stand in the way of her happiness. He extended his hand. "You have my conditional blessing, Your Grace, conditional upon my daughter's freely given consent." George accepted the offered hand with evident relief. "I could ask for nothing more fair, Mr. Montemayor." When Valentina was summoned to the study shortly thereafter, she found the two men in unexpectedly amicable conversation. Her father's expression was thoughtful, but not disapproving, while George's contained a barely suppressed elation that made her heart quicken. "Valentina," Edmund began once she was seated, "His Grace has shared with me the events of the past weeks, including the situation with Lord Blackwood and his personal feelings toward you." He paused, studying his daughter's face. "Before I offer any definitive response to his request for your hand, I must know if these feelings are reciprocated." Valentina felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of a journey that had begun with hostility and transformed into something profound and unexpected. Looking from her father to George, she answered with simple honesty, "They are, Father. What began as opposition has evolved into the deepest affection and respect. I love him, not for his title or position, but for the man he has proven himself to be." Edmund nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then you have my blessing, though I caution you both that the path ahead may not be easy." "The worthiest paths rarely are," George replied, his gaze fixed on Valentina, with an intensity that made the rest of the world seem to fade away. With her father's blessing secured, George formally proposed that evening in the Montemayor drawing room, kneeling before Valentina in the traditional manner despite her protests that such formality was unnecessary between them. "Valentina Montemayor," he said, taking her hand in his, "you have transformed my understanding of what matters most in this life. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, allowing me the privilege of walking beside you through whatever challenges and joys the future may hold?" "Yes," she replied simply, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "With all my heart, yes." The kiss that sealed their engagement was brief but tender, a promise of deeper intimacy to come, witnessed only by the portraits of Montemayor ancestors who seemed to gaze down with bemused approval at this unexpected turn of events. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Announcements were prepared for the Times and other publications, while George and Edmund collaborated on strategies to counter Lord Blackwood's campaign against both families. James Harrison was summoned to London, bringing with him documentation of the investors who had withdrawn support following Blackwood's interventions. Most significantly, the mill worker Thomas Jennings arrived with the foreman, bringing with him a detailed description of the stranger he had observed before the fire. When shown a series of portraits under the guise of identifying possible mill patrons, Jennings unhesitatingly selected an image of Lord Blackwood's private secretary, a man known to execute his employer's more delicate commissions. This evidence, combined with financial records showing unusual payments from Blackwood's accounts to individuals connected with the mill fire, created a compelling case. Rather than pursuing immediate legal action, however, George opted for a more strategic approach. "A public scandal would damage many beyond Blackwood himself," he explained to Valentina, as they walked in the gardens of Westmere House the day before their engagement was to be announced, including innocent family members and political associates who were unaware of his actions. "What do you propose instead?" she asked, appreciating his consideration of wider consequences. "A private confrontation with irrefutable evidence presented and a choice offered," George replied. "Blackwood can either withdraw permanently from London society, perhaps to his estates in Scotland or to the continent, or face public exposure and potential criminal charges for his role in the mill fire." Valentina considered this approach. "You believe he would accept such terms?" "Blackwood values his reputation and freedom above all else," George confirmed. "Given the evidence we've assembled, I believe he will choose the path that preserves both, even at the cost of his position in London." The confrontation occurred that evening in George's study at Westmere House, with only Edmund Montemayor present as witness. Lord Blackwood arrived confident and slightly condescending, clearly expecting some form of reconciliation following their recent estrangement. His demeanor changed dramatically as George methodically presented the evidence connecting him to both the financial machinations against the Montemayors and the Briarwood Mill fire. By the time George outlined the terms of his offer, immediate and permanent departure from London versus public exposure and prosecution, Blackwood's face had drained of color. "You would do this?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. "Destroy a 15-year friendship and ally over a merchant's daughter? You destroyed our friendship when you chose to endanger innocent lives at my mill," George replied evenly. "As for Valentina, she will shortly become my wife and the future Duchess of Westmere. Any disrespect toward her or her family will be regarded as a direct insult to me, an insult I will not tolerate from you or anyone else." The finality in his tone left no room for further argument. Lord Blackwood departed within the hour, and by morning, rumours circulated that he had been called away urgently to his Scottish estate due to a family emergency. Within a week, it was understood that he would be taking an extended tour of the continent for his health, a convenient fiction that preserved his dignity while removing him from the sphere of influence he had abused. With this threat neutralized, the announcement of the engagement between Duke George Westmere and Miss Valentina Montemayor appeared in the Times the following day, causing precisely the sensation in London society that George had predicted. Reactions ranged from scandalized whispers to pragmatic acceptance, with a surprising number of progressively minded peers offering genuine congratulations. "Society will adjust," George assured Valentina, as they reviewed the varied responses over breakfast at Westmere House, where she and her mother had been invited for morning refreshments. "Those whose good opinion is worth having will come to know you as I do. The rest matter little." Sophia Montemayor, observing their interaction with maternal satisfaction, nodded in agreement. "When I married a merchant despite my family's objections, I was told I would regret abandoning my place in society. Instead, I found a happiness that transcended such narrow definitions of belonging. Besides," Edmund added with unexpected humor, "between His Grace's title and our family's financial resources, even the most rigid social arbiters will find reasons to reconcile themselves to the match. Pragmatism often trumps principle in London drawing rooms." The wedding was set for early autumn, a compromise between George's desire for an immediate ceremony and the practical need for appropriate preparations. In the intervening months, Valentina divided her time between wedding arrangements and more substantive matters close to her heart. With George's full support, she established a foundation to improve conditions for workers across his various estates, beginning with the implementation of education programs for children previously employed in mines and mills. The partnership between Montemayor Shipping and Harrison Manufacturing proceeded as planned, with the Duke's investment strengthening the alliance and creating new opportunities for fair employment practices. On the day of their wedding, St. George's Hanover Square was filled with an eclectic mixture of aristocracy, gentry and prosperous merchants, a visible representation of the bridges their union had begun to build between traditionally separate social spheres. As Valentina walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she caught sight of George waiting at the altar, his expression one of undisguised joy and pride. When the moment came to exchange vows, the Duke departed from tradition by raising her hand to his lips before all assembled, the public acknowledgement of respect and devotion that completed their journey from adversaries to partners. "I take thee, Valentina, to be my wedded wife," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "to honor and cherish all the days of my life, as equal in worth and wisdom, different in perspective, but united in purpose." The personalized addition to the traditional vows brought tears to Valentina's eyes as she responded in kind, promising to walk beside him as partner and equal in the life they would build together. As they emerged from the church into the autumn sunshine, George paused at the top of the steps, taking both her hands in his and raising them to his lips in a gesture reminiscent of their first tentative connection in the garden at Bath. "From unfit to be a wife to Duchess of Westmere," he murmured for her ears alone, his eyes alight with love and gentle humor. "Perhaps we should both be more cautious about hasty judgments in the future." Valentina laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "Or perhaps we should remember that transformation is always possible, even for the most unlikely of hearts." As they descended the steps to begin their new life together, neither could have predicted the full extent of the transformations their union would inspire, not only in their own lives but in the society they would help reshape through their example of love that transcended the artificial boundaries of class and convention. The end. Dear listener, there are moments in life when we're made to feel we're not enough, not noble enough, not young enough, not quiet enough, not proper enough. But this story reminds us that our true worth lies not in titles or appearances, but in the courage to speak up, to stand tall and to stay true to our convictions. Even when the world turns its back, like Valentina, many of us have been misunderstood or dismissed. And like the Duke, many have needed time and a spark of truth to awaken the best parts of themselves. So tonight, if your heart feels heavy, if your days have been long, please remember, you are seen, you are worthy, and it is never too late for redemption, for change, or for love. Even the coldest seasons end. Even the most guarded hearts can learn to kneel and kiss the hand of the one they once rejected. Sleep peacefully, knowing that everything you've lived through has shaped a soul full of dignity, strength, and beauty. With warmth and gratitude, Legends of the Fall Team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us stay motivated to keep telling stories filled with love, redemption, and unforgettable twists. And remember, at the end of this video, you'll see another suggested story from our channel. Click on it and get ready to be surprised, moved, and inspired once again.